Namaste and greetings. I, Fiza Mahajan, visiting researcher at IMPRI, Impact and Policy Research Institute, New Delhi, Prabhav एवं नीति अनुसंधान संस्थान, Nai Delhi, extend a warm welcome to you all for joining us today for Day 5 of the Feminist Foreign Policy Fellowship and Online International Winter School Program. This 3-month Immersive Leadership Certificate Training Fellowship is proudly brought to you by the IMPRI Center for International Relations and Strategic Studies and the IMPRI Gender Impact Studies Center in collaboration with the Asia Foundation. Our chair for this program is Professor Vibhuti Patelji, visiting distinguished professor at IMPRI and former professor at Tata Institute of Social Sciences, Mumbai. We are grateful for her continued guidance and leadership. The expert for today is Ms. Rita Manchanda, Research Director at South Asia Forum for Human Rights. We will share video recordings of each session to support flexible learning at your convenience. The guidelines document will be emailed to you after the session for your perusal. And before we start today's session, I would like to announce the housekeeping rules once again. It is imperative that you join the meeting on time. There will be a Q&A session after each presentation. Share your questions in the Q&A box and not in the chat box. The questions must not be posted as an anonymous attendee. Ensure that your questions are precise and refrain from making general comments in the question to save time. Now, I would request Professor Vibhuti Patelji to start the session with her opening remarks. Over to you, ma'am.
Yeah. Thank you, Fiza, for your welcome address. Today, we are in Day 5 of this Feminist Foreign Policy Fellowship Program, jointly organized by the Asia Foundation and Impact and Policy Research Institute. I first of all offer my heartfelt thanks to Ms. Nandita Barua, Ms. Apurva Singh, Dr. Arjun Kumar, and Dr. Simi Mehta, who are the conveners of this mammoth important course, and the coordinators who are backing the whole program. Mr. Satyam Tripathi, Ms. Vidita Jha, Shweta Shankar, and today's moderator, Fiza Mahajan. I welcome Ms. Rita Manchanda, who is going to enlighten us on gender, refugees, and the politics of feminization of refugee subject, extremely important global challenge that most of the nation states are facing on this planet. A brief recap of what all has transpired in the previous sessions. First, it began with Dr. Simi Mehta providing a profile of previous 3 courses on feminist foreign policy, in which more than 800 to 1,000 participants were there. It was an open course for everybody. And this time we got 1,100 applications, and out of which some 49 of you are here with us as fellows. Ms. Nandita Barua, in her erudite opening remarks, she talked about her organization, the Asia Foundation, which is working in 19 Asian countries. And also she flagged many important concerns in feminist foreign policy and talked about the importance of intersectional lens and also the larger framing of this issue from the perspective of Global South. And she acknowledged the role played by Beijing Conference 1995, especially the platform for action agenda that it gave, and it increased the global feminist solidarity. My presentation was on the question of whole women's movement and how during the International Women's Decade of 1985 to 1995, 1975 to 85, we had so many national, regional, and global interactions in those 10 years, and women's rights organization, feminist groups, they met, and so many common documents and common understandings came, whether it was a question of CEDAW or Nairobi forward-looking strategy, International Covenant on Population and Development, and the whole campaign against stabilization policies which were imposed by the global financial institutions on the developing country, which resulted in tremendous human misery due to curtailment of social sector budget. The inaugural keynote address was by Ms. Stephenie Foster, and who talked about 4 important constructs in feminist foreign policy. One was of gender equality as a goal and strategy, broadening of definition of humans from national security to human security, and elevation of diverse voices, and also addressing the historical power imbalances through feminist foreign policy. She also humorously told about the all international institutions which were dominated by the pale, male, and yell, and how we need to have a global feminist solidarity to address the current challenges, whether it is by Russo-Ukrainian war or the Israel-Gaza war. We had on day 2, we had Professor Sanjukta Bhattacharya, who spoke on origin and trajectory of theory and practice. She, as a political scientist, she gave various theories. She gave critical reflection on various theories on international relations. And she also concluded her with the optimistic note that developing countries like Mexico and Mongolia have also adopted feminist foreign policy, and she also admired the commitment of feminists from Colombia, 1,000 feminists who signed a petition and demanded the feminist foreign policy should be pacifist. We had Dr. Keshav Giri, who spoke on the international relations and Eurocentrism, and he talked about that why it is important to shift the focus from Eurocentric discourses and as a part of decolonialism. And he gave so many emulating examples of localization of decolonial efforts from South Asia. Also, he talked about Yogmata from Nepal, and also talked about Hansa Mehta's role in UDHR. And he also said that we need to broaden the definition of this thing. We have to transcend gender binary, and we also need to localize the feminist foreign policy. On day 3, we focused on intersectionality and gender mainstreaming in Global South, and that was my presentation. And on day 4, we had Anuradha Shinoji, who spoke on women in war, peace, security in South Asia, and she also brought in so many important concerns regarding the local conflicts, internal domestic conflicts, cross-border conflicts, and she said that it was women just biologically, they are not peace lovers. We have seen that women who follow the male model and they also are in the combat or not institution or national security officials like Condoleezza Rice, who rationalized 40,000 children dying in Iraq, and even Hillary Clinton used to use jingoistic rhetorics and quote unquote, "I'm always in a war room." So she ended her power-packed speech with an appeal that we need to talk of peace and connect national security with human security and social security. Then we had Professor Mariam Sadat Khan from South Africa, who spoke on global migration and feminist foreign policy. And she also talked about the what kind of disasters which militaristic solutions had found. And she ended her a lecture with saying that we don't want bootlickers of capitalist patriarchy, and we also don't want queen bee women in the international relations. Then we had Professor Manisha Madhava, who provided a rigorous analysis as a political scientist on engendering national security. And she said that what kind of critical alternatives to militarized security frameworks that we need to have. And then we, which resulted in many interesting interventions from the participants. And today we have Ms. Rita Manchanda, who has dedicated very valuable years of her life on the issue of international relations, refugee crisis, and the developments in South Asia. So she'll be enlightening us about the gender refugees and politics of feminization of refugee subject. Over to IMPRI team.
Thank you very much, and good evening. I'm really I'm delighted to be here, and I thank Vibhuti for enabling me to be part of this very important process. And thank you for having done a tour d'horizon of, in fact, the previous speakers, because it helps me to position what I'm going to say a little more clearly. One is, of course, that I'm opening the chapter on refugees. And you might well ask, what is so important about the refugee in studying feminist foreign policy in studying, in fact, conflicts. And I would say that the face of the civilian in conflict is actually the refugee, which is why it's so important to engage with the refugee crisis, the protection, the care, and the resettlement of the refugee, and also to look at the politics of refugee making. Now, in this, I would like to say that often it's seen that the refugee, and if we look at, say, Ukraine, 6.7 million refugees, or you look at the forcibly displaced who remain within borders, the IDPs, the internally displaced person. Manipur, 60,000. Even in the Ukraine, it's 3.5 or 4 million. And so we are looking at extremely large numbers. Now, is this just a byproduct of war? Or is it actually the intentional objective of some of the war strategies? I would argue that it is the intentional objective of, in fact, cleansing out populations, unwanted, expendable populations from a territory. It's a way of creating hostages. It's, in fact, a fairly complex strategy of intent, of not merely collateral damage. And I would also here like to foreground the critical importance of women in this producing or the production of refugees, which is, people don't leave their homes. People don't disrupt their social systems, their economic livelihood structures, their lives, just like that. Voluntary, forcible displacement occurs when there is, yes, generalized insecurity, but you need a greater push. Often that greater push is the targeted attack on women, the sexualized violence against women. If I had to give an immediate example, I would say the Rohingyas. The Rohingyas have been a persecuted minority for decades, but it took the targeted attacks, sexualized, brutal, torturous attacks on women to actually see these floods of people crossing the border and making their way across to Bangladesh and further across to India, Pakistan, Malaysia, Indonesia, and so forth. And I think it's very important to emphasize that sexualized violence is very much an aspect of, in fact, the production of refugees. And yet, the irony is that despite the material reality, the statistical reality of 80% of the refugee, the displaced IDP population being women and children, that is overwhelming majority, something like 70 to 80%, because as we know, young men get killed, they go missing, or they become soldiers in various states, non-state armies. It's the women. I mean, women today are being recruited as well, but largely speaking, women with their dependent children form the bulk of the refugee population. Yet, as I said, the irony is that the international refugee regime is gender blind. If you look at it, there is the definition in the 1951 Convention on the Status of Refugees talks about people fleeing for reasons of well-founded fear of persecution. What is in fact identified? Race, religion, your political opinion, your membership of a social group. There is no recognition of gender-based violence. And yet, as we've seen just now, very briefly, women are central to, in fact, the refugee crisis. And yet there is no recognition that gender-based violence, that gender persecution can also be well-founded reasons for people to escape, for people to flee across borders, for gender-based asylum seekers to seek refugee status. Yet there is no recognition. it was in fact only 6 decades, I mean, even 6 decades later, which is today, we still, despite the fact that now there is so much feminist scholarship, there is so much policy advocacy, we have femocrats in the UN system. Even then, you take Rohingyas. Has there been any real recognition? Yes, we talk about Rohingyas as suspect terrorists. What about the Rohingya women? Is there any particular response in terms of recognizing them as eligible? Even the Afghan women, it's only recently, and I will come to that, it's really only in 2023 that, in fact, the UNHCR recognized that they should be recognized as refugees presumptively. It was only this year in October that the European Court of Justice said that gender and nationality determines that Afghan women should be recognized as eligible for refugee status. Now, it was actually Yugoslavia, and this is Yugoslavia. This is the 1990s, the big breakup of Yugoslavia, the post-Yugoslavia crisis. And at that point of time, not only did you have a great deal of media attention about the sexualized violence, which was very, very prominent, about the gender-based violence, the forced pregnancies. I mean, after all, you had the tribunals, on Rwanda and in Yugoslavia. And you had also in 1998, the statute of the International Court of Justice, including rape as a weapon of war, gender persecution as a crime against humanity, and it included forced pregnancies. You also had, today you have a situation where there is the draft Convention on Crimes Against Humanity, an effort to include into that draft convention gender apartheid. So there is a lot of this kind of churning. Yet how does it actually get translated in terms of real status determination of a gender-based asylum seeker? And this is, I want to unpack, in fact, the complexity of the gender-blind international regime, the way it gets translated into multiple forms of discrimination against women asylum seekers, who particularly when they use gender-based asylum as the grounds for seeking refugee protection. I would also like, the second half of my presentation will involve looking at the politics of what I call the feminization of the refugee subject. You know, the poster image, and this is yet once again the irony. We don't recognize gender-based asylum, but we do recognize that the poster image of the refugee is this destitute, impoverished woman with 2 children clinging to her. What does this represent? This represents, of course, destitution. It represents desperation. It represents helplessness, passivity, the lack of agency, and depoliticization. I will argue that this is a very political image. This is not an innocent image, and it is meant to actually influence the solutions that are available for the refugee crisis. That is, if earlier integration or resettlement in a third country were the options, the preferred options, today it's not that. Today it is return. Today it is repatriation. Today it is pushback from the borders before they even enter and get involved in any kind of a process that will require even detention, deportation, or eventually integration. So let me just first really do a very brief cameo of what is the international refugee regime. 1951, it came about at a time, India too was involved in this, but India never signed the Refugee Convention. And I will go in a little bit into that, why they didn't. So in 1951, the Refugee Convention emerged essentially as a way of dealing with the post-World War II refugee flows. And this was very much something refugees were welcomed in Europe, in in Europe, in Western Europe, as well as in North America, Australia, Canada, and Australia, because one, there was a labor shortage after the war. Two, they were like us, meaning they were like Europeans, they were like the Western, so there was no issue of cultural compatibility. They were just one of us. And we've seen that with the Ukrainian refugees and the way that they have been welcomed with open arms, and the way the Syrian refugees have been pushed back and have been contained in Syria, in Turkey. Or how the Rwanda is emerging as a possible camp for refugees or asylum seekers in the UK. So this it emerged very much as I said, to integrate the flow from the World War to, as well as it then became embedded in the Cold War politics. The welcome that was given to people fleeing Eastern Europe, the socialist bloc, and voting to enter by their footfall to Western Europe or the North America or Australia. So that it was very much a structure in which not only were they reintegrated, were they seen as culturally compatible, but they were never described as destitute, impoverished, helpless, passive. On the contrary, they were seen as bringing skills, they were seen as people who could be integrated. The shift came when you had decolonization happening, and you had the disruption in resulting in multiple conflicts, as well as economic distress, and therefore the push towards Europe of flows from Africa, from Asia, from conflicts in Asia, conflicts in Africa. And one of our finest professors on refugee studies, Professor B.S. Chimney, wrote something called The Myth of Difference. And here the emphasis is on myth rather than difference. The difference were, of course, color. The difference was culture. But it was a myth of difference, a myth that meant that you were trying to construct something that would see a pushback. I will come to this when I look at the politics of the feminization of the refugee regime. But just before I go into the gender blindness of it, I want to also mention, as far as India is concerned, although it was involved in the drafting of, in fact, the Refugee Convention, it chose not to sign. It chose not to sign because it said it's completely Eurocentric. You're not even willing to recognize. We had, they said this is a transfer of population from Pakistan into India. It's not, in fact, refugee flows. It's not migration. This is a transfer of population. And so he said, well, if it's not relevant to us, and I would here urge you to read Pia Oberoi's work on this, on why India did not, India's relationship with UNHCR, as well as why it did not sign. None of the countries of South Asia, except Afghanistan, have signed the Refugee Convention. But nonetheless, they all have various arrangements with UNHCR. We have a memorandum of understanding through UNDP with UNHCR, which enable, and the mandate is a pretty limited and a pretty shaky mandate, but nonetheless, refugee status determination and some level of practices of care and resettlement are recognized by the Indian government. And we have a hybrid system. We look after Sri Lankans. We look after Tibetans, we meaning the Indian government, the executive authority. But as far as Afghans are concerned, Burmese refugees, and that includes Rohingyas and Chins, as well as the student refugees escaping the authoritarianism. And then we have also refugees from who are from Somalia, from Nigeria, and so forth. About UNHCR's persons of concern, persons of interest are fairly limited. Their mandate, as I said, is pretty limited, and we do have a hybrid regime. We do not have any refugee policy. And so this legal precarity actually makes refugees very, very vulnerable. Not only it makes uncertain what real rights they have. Are they totally rightless, or do they have rights? And we've had a lot of judicial activism as well as NGO activism in support of the refugees. And some of the judicial activism has resulted in right to life with dignity being extended to all persons who live on the Indian territory, which includes refugees, which includes foreigners. However, people who do not have valid passport, valid visas, and are not Indian citizens are clubbed into the category of foreigners. And if they violate the Foreigners Act, which is they do not have valid papers, they do not have valid visas, then they are in fact seen in violation of the 1946 Foreigners Act and are considered illegal and liable for arrest and deportation. Refugees and those that have been recognized by UNHCR were earlier, of course, exempt from this kind of detention and deportation. But however, there has been a steady degradation of human rights, and particularly in 2017, Rohingya refugees, which earlier actually were given long-term visas to stay on, suddenly you found a change in the whole attitude. Not only were they now being called terrorists, they were being threatened with deportation. An order was given that they must be rounded up, arrested, and deported. The problem, of course, with the Rohingyas is a particularly critical one. Myanmar does not accept the Rohingyas as their citizens. They regard them as Bangladeshis. And another irony is Bangladesh, which is the largest recipient of the Rohingya flows, does not recognize the Rohingyas. In fact, the Rohingyas are sheltered in camps which are not under UNHCR. They're under the International Organization for Migration. They're called migrants, or they're called Myanmar citizens, or they're called whatever. They are not, in fact, even seen as refugees. So not only are the Rohingya stateless, but their refugee status has been questioned. More than 600 have been arrested. And there is this, real pick and choose policy as far as who gets arrested. A lot of young women, a lot of minorities, meaning minors, get arrested who are 14, 12, 13-year-olds, women who get picked up. Their children are waiting for them to breastfeed them, and they're being picked up. So it's really arbitrary, ad hoc. It's frankly, there is no policy. But nonetheless, this is happening. Deportation. The Supreme Court in a 2021 judgment did a very important judgment, because for the first time, the Supreme Court specifically said, we do not recognize the customary law of non-refoulement. Non-refoulement is no pushback of a person, asylum seeker, to a place of danger, of risk, of threat for that person. We said we don't recognize it, although it is the core component of the Refugee Convention, of international human rights law, but we said we don't recognize it, and therefore they're liable for deportation. Of course, the problem was, as I said, they cannot be deported because Myanmar will not take them. So they are languishing in jail, and I am myself a petitioner in a case before the Supreme Court, contesting indefinite detention of the Rohingyas. But to come back to the gender neutral, it's not a gender neutral regime, it's a more gendered blind regime. Because, as I said, one, it does not recognize gender-based asylum as a grounds for status determination of refugee. Now, how does this operate? We know, okay, let's take the most egregious case of sexualized gender-based violence. Now, you all know how reluctant people are, women are, to actually come out and talk about it. One, not only are they suffering trauma, two, more likely than not, because UNHCR is pretty understaffed and pretty badly funded. So as a result, often the person, the refugee worker who will be translating will be from the community. How many women are like, if you're an Afghan woman, are you likely to admit that you were gang raped or raped? Not only would you have trouble within your own community, whatever chances you had of leading a normal life would be finished. Also, you're also scared. You'll be called a prostitute. You will be treated like a prostitute by not only your own community, by the guards, by by everyone. And your chances for resettlement might get compromised because you will be seen as sullied. So there are all kinds, why women rarely tell their refugee workers that they've been violated. Of course, it happens. There is documentation when something like, say, the Rohingya case happened, and you had Razia Sultan's book called Rape by Command, in which she documents the rape of 300 women, brutalized gang, mutilations, 300 women in 320 villages. In one sort of short period. But this is quite exceptional. It's extremely difficult. And then, of course, cultural issues step in. DRC, the Congo, is famous for, in fact, rape in conflict. I don't know whether, and you see, and I sent you a reading by Linda Bartolome and Eileen Pitilve, in which they talk about a Women at Risk project in Australia, and where they were hardly able to find any women who qualified for status determination, because they said, it's only rape. And in their culture, consent norms or, the practice is so common that, it's not really a violation. They're used to it. So there is also a lot of this kind of colonial prejudices. These are colonial imaginations. After all, what is the Congo? Congo is the heart of darkness. Congo is primitivism. Congo is Black Africa at its heart. And therefore, it's also, these racial prejudices that come in, cultural prejudices. Afghan women. And we've done a study of Afghan women, refugee women. These were women who came fleeing areas where the Taliban had already taken over. Our refugee sample did not include too many women who came after the takeover. Some, yes, but most of the sample was before. But these were all areas already taken over by the Taliban or already under the influence of these warlords. And these women, 50% of them were rejected in their application. Now, who were these women? These were women who did not admit to us that they had been sexually violated, nor did we actually ever push them, because we knew they're not going to tell us. But what they did talk about was forced marriage. These are women who, and particularly a lot of them are Hazara women. Hazaras are a minority in Afghanistan. They are the more progressive community in Afghanistan. A lot of their women have a little more freedom. Many of these women were not elite women. The elite women don't come and seek refuge in India. These were women who were from the lower middle class, barely middle class, first generation literates, but they were literate. They were going to school, and some commander, meaning local militia commander or somebody, would see them maybe the local Khan or something, twice their age, and would say, you're going to marry me. They would, accost them as they were going to school, slap them around, say, I'm going to rape you, I'm going to abduct you. Maybe they were even abducted, managed to escape. These women escaped these kind of marriages. They were the ones who managed through their parents, through contacts, to get sort of a ticket. And at that time, they could fly out of Afghanistan to India. India was close enough, India was cheap enough, and India was considered, because it was proximate, culturally not so different, they were trusted in terms of that their parents agreed to send them, because many of these girls are 17, 18, 19 years old. They're not particularly grown up adults or anything like that, but they came. These are and these are women who applied for refugee status, women suffering from domestic violence, who got married at the age of 14, had 4 children within 4 years. Husband dies, and the local commander decides to abduct the woman, separate her from her children. And he's already married, has 18 kids, she's ill-treated by everyone, beaten up by everyone. She manages, she does produce 2 more children. And as one of the girls is growing up, they say, well, why don't we marry her to someone who is twice her age, who is a warlord? He will treat her well. She escapes that. She finds a shelter somehow and manages to escape to India. She applies for refugee status. It's not recognized as domestic violence. It's not recognized as gender-based violence. All this happens, of course, before 2023. When in fact UNHCR issues this guideline or directive saying Afghan women will be considered presumptively eligible for refugee status. Of course, they didn't know about it. The interviews we did were all in 2023 and 2023 and 2024. They didn't know about this. UNHCR also doesn't think it is relevant to tell them that they're eligible for this. Does it make no difference? And many of these women now, I have to say, are no longer in India. They did manage to get third country resettlement. But this whole issue of UNHCR appropriating the agency of refugees, they have lost voice. You've seen some images of men rather than women with their mouths sealed and sewn up as protest. It's in fact a very physical expression or articulation of their silencing, of the appropriation of their agency. Refugees cannot speak for themselves. Refugees cannot negotiate with another country for third country settlement. It's all done through bureaucrats and so forth. It's not ever done. So the refugees are actually made voiceless, and the feminization of the refugee subject actually helps in that. And I will come back to that. So despite the fact that since in 1985, you've had n number of guidelines issued by UNHCR and driven by the statistical reality of the sheer numbers of women who are refugees, they've issued guidelines about, proper treatment, no family separation, about empowering women refugees, about there is an interagency circular in 1995 saying that whether there is evidence of refugee women in a conflict situation having been raped or having been sexually assaulted, whether there's evidence or not, you should just presume that they have, because that is the reality, and the women will not speak up on that reality. I've just recently got an alert from feminist friends in South Africa about Lebanon, alerting me about the surge in gender-based violence in Lebanon. There is no evidence. There are no reports about it, but we know that this is happening. because it does happen. Now, there is no evidence, so that means there will be no status determination of eligibility for protection. So that is, as I said, one of the main issues, that status determination for refugee women becomes hugely difficult. You know, Yugoslavia, what actually put conflict, women in armed conflict on the map, not very many Yugoslav women were recognized as refugees. Despite, in fact, all the publicity, all the literature, the scholarly work, and so forth, they were not. And Rohingyas, I don't need to emphasize. Now, what does it mean? Of course, I've talked about refugee status determination, but what are some of the other aspects of discrimination which are embedded in the refugee regime, protection regimes? One is, you know, registration is done, family registration is done. And when we talk about families, male-headed families, if you happen to be, and as I've mentioned to you, a lot of single women come on their own. They have to join a family. And okay, you're registered as a family. Now, suppose you fight, I mean, there is a lot of domestic violence in the refugee situation, and I don't think I need to elaborate why. Men without jobs, men who have been disempowered are likely to take it out on women. And so there is huge levels of domestic violence. There is also situations where second marriages and all take place. Even if you are beaten up, even if you are in a situation which you want to jump out of, even if there's a second wife, unless she's registered or unless you can find a new registration, you will lose out on all the entitlements that a refugee who is registered gets. You won't risk it. But it's because of this male the prototype of the refugee is a male. And it is this regime, the male, and it is driven by, in fact, a male framework. The other aspect is, we know that at least in South Asia, not all marriages are registered. And if you don't have a registered marriage, how are you going to establish I'm his wife? So there is also those kind of issues. Then there is the issue of, we know today, participation is protection. But women are seen as passive. Women are seen as helpless. Women are seen as desolate. There is a quote by Mrs. Ogata, who was the High Commissioner for Refugees, one of the better known High Commissioner for Refugees. And she says, and she's talking about, she's trying to actually get more donations. And she makes a very powerful appeal. She says, look at this woman. She's trapped in a cycle of hopelessness. She's impoverished. She has these 2 clinging children. She's in a hopeless, helpless situation. She is our priority to help. But what are you doing by this kind of image making? What you're doing is you're reinforcing her helplessness, you're reinforcing her capacity for action, and which is, as I hope to demonstrate, a complete lie, because refugee women don't sit on their hands. They, in fact, are usually the most active in a refugee situation because they have to be. And it is this denial of agency. Of course, I can see why she said this. She said it so you would press the button and donate. And that is why the poster image is that of a woman with 2 children clinging to her, an Afro-Asian woman. But it comes at a cost. It comes at a cost of disempowering. And we've seen this right across. The vulnerability of women must not be conflated with victimhood and denial of agency. The vulnerability of women in conflict should, because if so, then not only are they pushed out of all peace processes, they're also pushed out of participation in a way that they will have their claim to land titles. They will have claim to determining how the refugee food distribution takes place, about how healthcare is managed, and also about what are particular women needs. You know, menstrual hygiene products are usually are not prioritized, because men who are determining what is the refugee plan of action do not factor this in, because it's not a priority. I mean, the gender blindness of refugee regimes is in fact evidenced by the fact that we do not collect sex disaggregated data. If we could collect sex disaggregated data, then we would know in forcibly displaced situation or in a refugee situation how many women were pregnant, how many were likely to give birth, how many would be lactating, what are the needs of natal needs of young babies, and so forth. So, you know, a lot of this could be catered for, because for most, reproductive issues are not men's issues, and therefore they will not be prioritized, which is why one is saying that participation is protection. I would now like to, you know, maybe shift to the whole politics of the feminization of the refugee subject. Now, when I say refugee subject, I'm not only talking about women, I am talking about men as well. And this feminization. Now, till, in fact, the major flow of refugees were European refugees, there was very much, as I said, integration was the preferred option. And the image of the refugee was that of East European crossing the border, sometimes alone, sometimes with family, certainly not destitute, but bringing with him skills, bringing with him what would be a desirable cultural assimilation. With decolonization and the flow of refugees from Asia and African conflict situations, there was, today we call it Fortress Europe, but there was this extreme uneasiness, and the construction of concepts like the myth of difference. You also had, and here I refer to a wonderful essay by Heather Johnson, brilliantly titled Click to Donate, but where she talks about 3 shifts in the imagination of refugees. And one is, as she calls it, I think, what was it? Sorry, 1 second. Yes, racialization, obviously, racialization. Then these racialized, and the racialized refugee here is seen as a victim, not as somebody who comes with resources, with skills that are desirable and required, but a victim, somebody who will have to be helped. And the final one, which is feminization. And feminization, why? Because it's in a way a naturalization of, in fact, destitution, naturalization of helplessness, of passivity, of and therefore the moral logic for the erasure, not denial, erasure of agency. And you suddenly, and this, because otherwise, how would you in fact justify